double check, make sure. Test, 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 test. Okay. Test, test. Okay. Test, test. Oh yeah, now we're looking. Let me shut this. All right. Well, welcome to this Facebook Live broadcast from the Ignatian Solidarity Network. My name is Chris Kerr, Executive Director of ISN, and today I'm joined by Eileen Markey, author of Radical Faith, The Assassination of Sister Maura. And of course, this refers to Sister Maura Clark, a Maryknoll sister who, along with fellow Maryknoll sister Ida Ford, Ursuline sister Dorothy Kazel, and lay missionary Jean Donovan were raped and killed in El Salvador on December 2nd, 1980. This Friday marks the 36th anniversary or commemoration of that horrible date in history. And Eileen, welcome. We're glad to have you here with us. Thank you so much for joining us virtually. And we're excited to talk about this new book. Just to provide folks a little more context, last year at the Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice, we commemorated the 35th anniversary. I know there were many people in El Salvador last year for that very special anniversary. Eileen, I know you mentioned earlier you were down there, but maybe we could start out. Eileen, you could tell us a little bit about how you came to feel called to write this book about Sister Maura.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here. I grew up, like a lot of people, learning about the church women as examples of committed Christianity, of true Catholicism. As a child, my parents were involved in Pax Christi and still are. And that movement and those organizations always made sure that the church women were remembered, and that the work they were doing and the sacrifices they made were something that stayed alive in the memory of Catholics and of other people in the U.S. So I always grew up learning about them and learned about them in high school as well, and was inspired by them as examples of what it meant to take your faith seriously, what it meant to serve God in the real world. I'm a journalist, and I spent the better part of 20 years reporting on issues in New York City on homelessness and housing and poverty. But about 5 years ago, I realized that while the church women's story had inspired me and really shaped a lot of my deepest ideas about what it meant to be Catholic, that I didn't really know many of the details. I'd seen the inspiring quotes and I was familiar with that poster, but I realized I didn't really know who these women were when they were alive. And there was something about that we only knew them as dead, that we only knew them as people who had been killed, and it's that their murder is the thing that we know about them. Which makes sense, but I wanted to understand who they were before that. What was their life, and what was the life that led them to this scene that we're all familiar with. So Maura's family, at the same time, had always wanted a biography written of her. Maura's sister felt that people didn't really know her sister beyond the couple of quotes, and wanted to have a full portrait of this woman who she knew was not a plaster saint, was a real person who had real struggles and a full life. And so Julia wanted people to really know her sister as a human being, and that suited my idea. I realized it would be good for me to spend a long time thinking about an important thing and to really examine what this story that I'd grown up with, but I wanted to understand what it really meant and who this woman was before.
Sure. And again, for those who are just joining us, we welcomed Eileen Markey, author of A Radical Faith, The Assassination of Sister Maura, referring to Sister Maura Clark, who was killed on December 2nd, 1980. It'll be 36 years this Friday that happened. And she was murdered along with three other church women. And we're talking about the book. Eileen, So, what I think to your point, the book gets into great depth about Sister Mara's life. And I think a lot of people, they know that date, December 2nd, 1980. But Sister Mara came to us, to Central America in 1959. Can you talk a little bit about the depth of history of her time over the course of many years before she was murdered in 1980?
Yeah. So she went to Nicaragua, to a gold mining town called Ciuna, on the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua in 1959, to a really traditional mission, mission from the movies, right? A church, a school. It was very much a company town, so the gold mine was the reason for the existence of this town and really dominated all life there. And the sisters and Capuchin Franciscans ran a mission there to educate and provide religious instruction and religious services for the gold miners and their families. And in the beginning, it was that she was a teacher in the school, and eventually principal of the school and superior of that community of 8 or 9 sisters. But her time in Ciuna coincided with Vatican II. So during her 10 years there, the understanding of the role of sisters changed dramatically, evolved dramatically. And she took those, discussions and teachings and conversations that the Marianal sisters, like every other order of sisters, and like the whole church in those years, was puzzling through, and applied them to the work that she was doing and the work that the sisters she was with were doing in Ciuna. And so the mission shifted from being, a school where the goal was to imprint holiness and teach people how to be proper Catholics, right? It was a mission. It was a missionary idea that we can bring something to these people who don't have the faith, or who aren't practicing it properly. It's a colonial idea. But during the time she was there, because of the reinterpretation of what it meant to be a sister in the world, the work that the sisters were doing shifted to community empowerment, to lay adult faith formation, adult education. And so by the end of her time there, she and the other sisters were far more interested in building a community of God, right? Not just getting people inside the church and getting them to say the prayers right, but finding where God was in their lives and helping them articulate and make real what it meant to be a community of God, what it meant to be the people of God.
And what were some of the things that, when was that turning point for Maura in terms of, or let me say this, I know that in the book there's a lot of, in-depth look at the very pastoral ministerial work, and then how Sister Maura got involved with people coming to realize their sense of liberation and their sense of humanness, and that was happening throughout the Americas at that time. Do you feel like there are specific points of time or turning points for her where she discovered a new way of envisioning the church? You talk about Vatican II. Of course, she got there before Vatican II started. But then, yes, a lot of changes over time. Are there specific points where you feel like something happened for her, a light clicked?
Yeah, that was very much something I was studying and researching to understand. It's one of the turning points of her story. When did this understanding of church shift, and when exactly? We can say Vatican II, but when exactly? And so in the spring of 1964, the summer of 1964, the sisters implemented a program called Family of God, which was an adult faith formation curriculum developed in Chicago, actually. And they started doing that. They started meeting with people in their homes, sitting on the floor in the people's tiny shacks without any furniture. And this curriculum was a Palafieri influenced adult curriculum. So it was all questions. It wasn't the sisters preaching or teaching even. It was really the sisters asking questions, and people reading or having Bible stories read to them, because many people were illiterate. And then a series of questions. What does this mean to you? Are you your brother's keeper? What does Cain and Abel's story mean to you? What is Christian marriage? What are our responsibilities to each other? What does the Sermon on the Mount mean here in this gold mining town, in this place where you're hungry? And Maura, I think, was uniquely suited to do that. All of the sisters she worked with did this amazing work. Her particular gift, I think, was just a a tremendous interpersonal skill and an interpersonal orientation. So everyone I spoke to, I probably talked to 200 people for this book, everyone said that when Maura spoke to you, it felt like you were the only person in the world. You had her full attention. You had her entire regard. And so when she started asking people questions and listening to their answers, it totally changed her understanding of the world. And she was humble enough and sort of open and interpersonally sweet enough to really follow what the people were struggling towards, right? So when people started to grapple with this, oh, right, so to be a Catholic, it doesn't mean I have to, it isn't limited to bringing flowers to the church or making sure my child's baptized, but it means I have to grapple with the messages in these stories and these parables. All right, so people started to work on that and try to understand that in their own life. And Maura went with them. Maura made those, took those conversations to heart, and wanted to be united with whoever she was with as they found God in their real day-to-day lives.
And can you talk a little bit about just give us a sense, because I think a lot of people know the story of El Salvador because of Archbishop Romero and the Jesuits, and so when they think of the church women being killed, Sister Maura and the other women being killed in 1980, they probably think of those stories of El Salvador, but of course a lot of her time was spent in Nicaragua. Can you contrast a little bit of what you learned about the situation in Nicaragua during her time there versus what was evolving in El Salvador?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So she was killed, obviously, in El Salvador by the Salvadoran government. She had only been in El Salvador for 4 months. She arrived in the beginning of August. She was killed in December. Her whole missionary life was really in Nicaragua. And the changes in the church and the evolution of the popular church, the base Christian communities, applied liberation theology, was very similar in both countries, but she was there at the beginning of it in Nicaragua, and at a farther end point in El Salvador. So in Nicaragua, she really went through this process with all the people she lived with and taught with and prayed with. So I was able to speak to people who knew her in the old mission and then knew her when she moved to Managua in 1970 and started doing organizing for base Christian communities. And really what we would think of as community organizing people together to demand a fair price for water, to get accessible bus routes so people could get into the city for work. Really basic community organizing. But of course, it was motivated by and formed by this understanding of what it meant to be church, by this liberation theology idea that God isn't somewhere else. God's here with us, and God is suffering with us. God is the campesino who has lost his land and is now in the slum outside Managua. God is the market woman who can't get into the city because there's no bus. And so her understanding of that emerged at the same time and with all these people in Nicaragua who were transforming their understanding of what it meant to be church during those years. The same thing was happening in El Salvador, and there were other Marianal sisters going through that process in El Salvador, but she wasn't there yet. But it's really that transformation from God as something that exists in the sky or inside the tabernacle to God as something that exists here as well, in the street and in the witness of people coming together to try to build the kingdom of God. Mm-hmm. And that's in really, really nitty-gritty ways, like getting a bus route and getting a fair price for water.
Exactly. Let's move a little bit to 1980 and the time leading up to her death. I think people are often very familiar with the images of the women's bodies pulled from the grave. Many people have probably heard former late Ambassador Robert White speak about being there while that was happening, and others who were there, the pictures, the video. But talk about that time leading up to their death for Sister Maura, especially because, of course, she was coming from, had been in Nicaragua, spending time in El Salvador. Can you tell us, kind of walk us through the days leading up to it?
Yeah, so by 1980, this social movement for political and social reform in El Salvador had been moving apace for 15, 20 years. And this was a movement fed very much by Catholic social teaching, by these base Christian communities, by these small groups of Catholics speaking and praying together, and also by a more strictly political movement, right, by a leftist political movement. But they were interconnected and they fed each other. By the time she arrived in El Salvador, this movement had been moving for a long time and had already come in for intense repression, right? So it started with, let's have a fair election. Let's run some candidates who maybe will enforce the minimum wage laws. Let's see if we can get people who elected who will allow people to have tenure to the land that they farm. And that there was election fraud in 1972, and that didn't happen. But what did happen is that the government saw that poor people were working together and applying this very powerful idea that God is with them into the real world, into their actual struggles for things like access to food and money and land. And so the military government of El Salvador shot that down, engaged in unbelievable, brutal, and vicious repression. Of course, it was in March of 1980 that Archbishop Romero, now Blessed Romero, was assassinated, also by this government. And so when Maura arrived in August, it was already absolutely horrifying in El Salvador. And this social movement had already come in for unbelievable and vicious and horrifying repression. But I think it's important to understand that it was a long movement, maybe akin to our civil rights movement or to our labor movement. And, in this country, sometimes movements like that are ignored or are mocked or are marginalized. There they were met with being dragged out of your house and killed and butchered. So she came to El Salvador knowing very well that she was in grave danger, that anyone doing this kind of work was in grave danger. And one of the questions I had as I began the book is, right, so what were they actually doing there? We say they were serving the poor. Oh, they're serving the poor. So what does that mean? What did she do when she get up in the morning? Mm-hmm. And what I learned is that she and Ita were doing really three types of work. They were documenting human rights abuses, very much like Amnesty International does, going to the sites of massacres, going to the sites of extrajudicial killings, and getting the names and the dates and the times and the places and writing them down, and filing these reports with the Legal Aid Office of the Archdiocese. It's an office that Archbishop Romero had set up several years earlier and which was still operating. So they documented human rights abuses and brought them into the capital to be counted, to be filed, so that maybe someday justice could be done around them. That was one part of their work. Another part of their work was distributing food and clothing and eventually medicine to people in communities and villages that were cut off by the military, and that the military was attempting to, it's this counterinsurgency policy called Drain the Sea, where if there's an area where guerrillas are active, you want to wipe out anyone there so that the guerrillas have no hope for help. And so that meant that villages there, whether people were involved with the armed guerrillas or not, they were suffering and they were having these reprisals and being assassinated. And crucially in that fall, didn't have access to their land. So the harvest was disrupted. So people couldn't get food. And Ida Ford wrote during that summer, actually, that she was really frightened about famine because people weren't able to get out to their fields to farm because they would get shot if they were out in their fields, because they were suspected, rightly or wrongly, accurately or inaccurately, of being guerrilla sympathizers. So they delivered food to people and they delivered clothing to people. And then they also were still doing faith formation, adult empowerment work, meetings in the parish to talk about theology, to talk about the long history of El Salvador, to talk about what is a Christian commitment in a time of war, what do we need to do for each other. So it's these three types of work. And I'm sorry, another very crucial part of it was rescuing people, very directly rescuing people. So someone would come to the sister's house and say, there's a family that's just been burnt out of their home. The death squad's going to come back and kill them. Let's get them out of here. And Maura and Ita worked in one part of the country, and Dorothy and Jean worked in another part of the country. They knew each other and frequently cooperated, but they weren't always together. Mm-hmm. So Maura and Ita rescued many people, put them in the back of a Jeep or the back of a van and covered them up with blankets and got them past security checkpoints of National Guardsmen who were engaged in this counterinsurgency policy of kill everyone that you think could possibly be a dissident. And so I was able to find some of those people who say, I'm alive today because Maura put me in the back of a Jeep and got me past the checkpoints and got me to a refugee center. And, that was after the soldiers had come for me.
Wow. And what about the days, or even the days and hours leading up to it?
Leading up to their death. So I think for some of it's just so shocking, this idea that women religious would be targeted, that women religious would be killed, and sometimes maybe not everyone knows that they were directly targeted. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a sort of fog of war situation. It wasn't opportunistic, right? Beginning in October, they received death threats. All of the parish house where they lived and worked in the northern reaches of the country in Chalatenango, there was a death threat put on their door, said anyone who enters this house is a communist and will be killed. And then there was another threatening letter, and then Maura and also 2 other Maryknoll nuns left to go to Nicaragua for a regional meeting the Thanksgiving week of 1980. And while they were away, or while they were on their way back into El Salvador at the end of this meeting, there was another death threat delivered to the parish house. Everyone here is a communist. It starts tonight. So they knew very well that they were under threat, specific and credible and direct, we will kill you kind of threat. After that first death threat was put on the parish door in October, there was a meeting with the parish staff where it was agreed, let's confine our work to just this main town here. Let's not go out to the hinterlands and the more isolated settlements because it's not safe. But Maura kept doing that work because they said there's people there who need us. They need the food, they need the rescue, they need the accompaniment, right? They need our presence with them. So it was this slow, but maybe not even slow, a steady ratcheting up of threat against them until it was made real that night as they were coming out of the airport.
And I've visited the chapel near the gravesite and had a chance to pause and pray there with a group of actually we had a delegation to El Salvador in 2014 to remember the 25th anniversary of the Jesuits, and so we visited the chapel there. Can you talk a little bit about that evening, that coming from the airport? Of course, the airport in San Salvador is quite a distance from the city itself, and so you're out in kind of a rural area as you move back towards the city. Can you talk about that evening specifically?
Yeah, so they landed and got into a van that they had frequently ridden in throughout the fall. Dorothy and Jean had this van in the mission where they worked in La Libertad in a different part of the country. So Dorothy and Jean picked them up, and they drove out the airport road, and they were confronted with a roadblock that had been set specifically for them, a checkpoint. Soldiers had been ordered to stop traffic until they saw this white van, and then let them through, and then hold up traffic for a while, to have some time pass, and then let the rest of the traffic go through. We know most of that because of statements made by the National Guardsmen who actually killed them in the course of their trial, and in the course of some investigations before their trial. We also know about that white van business because there was a group of Canadian church people who were down there that same night and came through the airport at the same time, also in the same kind of a van. And they were stopped, and the soldiers, the National Guardsmen, made them get out of the car and were very interested in their passports and in who they were, and particularly in the female passengers. And then must have realized, these are not the ones we're looking for, and so they left. But it was a very frightening experience for those Canadian missionaries. So in my book, I begin with the scene that some of us are familiar with from the gravesite and Ambassador White, and then I end with them driving out that airport road. And every fact in my book is checked, and there's an end note for every sentence I state a fact in. I don't know precisely and exactly what happened from when they left that checkpoint. We know that 3 hours later, people in the area where their bodies were found heard gunshots. And then we know that the next morning, their bodies were discovered. And then that they were buried under the orders of the local military commander. And then on December 4th, that they were exhumed when news that they were there had trickled up through the archdiocese and also up to the embassy. But that ride from the airport is if you know this story, and if this story is kind of maybe why you're in El Salvador, it's a long road, and it's a dark road, and it's a very affecting thing to ride out and think, right, this is where this happened. This is where they took their last moments. And when they were stopped by the National Guard, they must have known what was coming because they'd seen so much death already. They had comforted so many people whose family members were assassinated in this similar way.
Sure. I'm joined by Eileen Markey, the author of A Radical Faith, The Assassination of Sister Maura. We're talking with Eileen today because this Friday is the 36th anniversary of the deaths of the 4 U.S. churchwomen, including Sister Maura Clark, who were killed in El Salvador on December 2nd, 1980. We're talking about that horrible night when the women were driving back from the San Salvador airport and were abducted, raped, and murdered. Of course, Eileen, the U.S. government was very much engaged in what happened in El Salvador and seemingly in the deaths of the 4 churchwomen. Can you talk a little bit about what you learned and what you wrote about U.S. involvement?
Right. So President Carter, like most U.S. presidents from the time of the end of World War II, was engaged in this worldwide calculus of the Cold War. So we will support any regime that resists the Soviet Union and resists Cuba, and any regime that seems to be friendly with Cuba or the Soviet Union, we are opposed to. And any movement that seems to be in line with those ideas of those countries, we are opposed to. So throughout the late 70s, but really since the end of World War II in varying degrees, we had always supported the Salvadoran military. We trained the Salvadoran military. We provided arms for them, but especially we provided funding for them and training. Calindres Alaman, the sergeant who directed the actual killing of the churchwomen, had spent September at a U.S. Military training school, the School of the Americas, which was then in Panama. It's now in Georgia, but at the time it was in Panama. He had spent September there, being trained by the U.S. military, and the course was called Defense of Human Rights. It was really a counterinsurgency training course with like a little add-on in like human rights. Mm-hmm. So yeah, they, like tens of thousands of other people in El Salvador and in Nicaragua and in Vietnam and in name a long list of countries, are victims of the Cold War, are among the millions of casualties of the Cold War. And, Fidel Castro just died this weekend. We took him so literally. So the U.S. policy was always, if anything's going to strengthen Cuba, if anything's going to strengthen the Soviet Union, we're against it. And Maura's thinking was actually more nuanced than that, which is interesting to think about, right? The person motivated by faith and the person who, did have advanced degrees and wasn't an expert on foreign policy, that she was the one, and as were the sisters she worked with and so many church people, they were able to make sort of more nuanced distinctions and say, well, if people are agitating because they want the minimum wage laws enforced, or they're agitating because they think you should be paid more when you produce all this coffee, or you want access to health care, or you want an education system, I'm going to go with those people because that's what my Catholic faith teaches me people of God deserve. And it didn't mean, in Maura's case, signing up for the tenets of communism or the tenets of Marxism. It meant signing up for the tenets of Catholic social teaching. It meant signing up for and supporting and really being fed by the great hope and the great joy and the great strength of poor people recognizing their dignity and coming together to build really hopefully and really optimistically, to build the kind of society that they believed Christ taught us to live in. But that was threatening to this regime in El Salvador, and the Salvadoran military was right to be threatened by it, right? Poor people standing together can make a lot of change, and had tremendous power, tremendous potential power. So the same things that happened in Nicaragua earlier in Maura's life, where when poor people started getting together and talking to their neighbors and recognizing that they had dignity and value and worth, it scared the heck out of the government, because it meant that these people weren't subjects anymore. It meant that they were actors in their own lives.
It's great to reflect on the story of Sister Maura and the other women. What do you think we can take from this story and apply to the realities of the world today? What can we learn that can help us to navigate the existence of injustice, the existence of economic inequality that face our country, that continue to face Central America, in particular El Salvador, today?
So I think there's many things we can take away from Maura's story. Some are very interpersonal and very kind of little way, right? She paid attention to people. And in this era when we're always looking at our phone and always thinking about the next tweet we're going to get and always just trying to win the next argument, she really paid attention to everyone she was with. She was deeply present. And everyone said that it was remarkable, that you felt paid attention to, you felt dignified by her care when she spoke to you. And I think that's honestly a very important part of this story, that Maura noticed people. To some of the other questions, after this election, I've been thinking about how one fights despair against how one fights hopelessness, about how one continues to struggle to build a more just world and to stay true to your convictions about what justice means and what truth means. And I think there's a lesson in Maura's life, and really in the continuing witness of so many Salvadorans who faced unspeakable horror, unspeakable depravity, and yet continued on. They, 36 years later, 25 years after the end of their civil war, there are still human rights activists who are poco a poco working to bring the intellectual authors of this torture to justice, and they haven't given up. And I think that's an important lesson. And then finally, the whole book can be read as a long meditation on Eucharist. There's kind of a Eucharistic scene in almost every chapter. And by that, I mean this idea of the incarnation and the physical becoming real, and the body of Christ being alive in us, in the people of God, in the people of the church. And that's what Maura's story is, I think, at heart, is this journey of a woman to be true to herself. She made vows when she was 22 years old to serve and love God and to follow God, to follow Christ. And she followed that vow for the rest of her life, even into great difficulty, even into doubt, even into fear, and even into a place that she knew was dangerous, but she saw her suffering Christ in people who were getting the short end of the stick. And she found her suffering Christ in the beauty and in the joy of communities coming together to try to make this promise that we hold real.
Amen. You were down in El Salvador last December for the 35th anniversary. Can you tell us maybe a moment or an experience from that time there that touched you or has stuck with you since you returned?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, there were so many. It was really special for me to be able to bring my children there. they've grown up now for 5 years with mommy doing this research and missing a lot of dinners and missing a lot of Saturday hangouts because I was up in my little office working on this. But they've also really they understand these stories because we talk about them, because they've been up to Maryknoll and they've been to Mass there and they've met sisters up there. I live about 45 minutes from the Maryknoll Sister Center. So during the week that we were in El Salvador, we went to the site where the church women's bodies were found, and there was a mass there and a sort of solemn procession into this site where they were found, where there's now a chapel. Mm-hmm. And we went up to Chalatenango, to the cemetery where they're buried, on an incredibly hot day with 150 or 200 people. But I think one of the things that I hope my kids remember most is actually that we spent several days with different communities in El Salvador, villages that continue to do this community organizing work, right? That work for girls' empowerment and women's safety and women's empowerment, that are trying to build up a local agricultural base, even in the face of really difficult trade imbalances because of NAFTA. We spent a lot of time in community organizing meetings where local activists told us what they do in their village and how what they do is a continuation of the empowerment work of the church women, and that they dedicate their work to the church women and are inspired by it. El Salvador is an incredibly dangerous country today. In fact, the murder rate is about the same as it was during the Civil War, which is horrifying. So our trip, which was with a lot of sisters from LCWR and some other people through the Share El Salvador Foundation, we had this tremendous security apparatus around us, which was really weird, right? We were on school buses, but we had soldiers and we had plainclothes soldiers on the buses, and we had other people in front of us and other people behind us. And because kidnapping is a really big risk, and there are many, many murders in El Salvador because of the gang violence, and human rights people say because of the inherited trauma of what happened 30 years ago, and the impunity, right? No one was ever punished for this 75,000 Salvadorans who were murdered during that war. Anyway, one day we were talking, my older son and I, or my husband, were talking to one of these security guys who's a soldier, right? Like, he's a Salvadoran security person. Of course, it's a different military than it was in 1980. But he works for the president, I guess, as a security person. And he said, whenever these tours come down, we do like advanced work. We wanted to know every place where you guys were going to go so that we could scope it out and make sure it was safe. And really, it wasn't so hard with this group because you're going to organized communities. You're going to communities that have a very strong community organizing operation, where the neighbors speak to each other, where the neighbors are united in a struggle for fairness and justice and liberation in their towns. And those are the communities that are safer. So the communities that were formed, these villages that were formed towards the end of the war by base Christian community people and other social movement people coming back to reclaim space, those communities are safer. And I think that is actually kind of what I hope my kids come away with, not the safety element so much, but this idea that when people work together, they're okay. They're making it work, right? Because they're struggling together. They trust each other. They work together. They have a political goal, and they have a vision of what they want their community to be like. And because they're united, this is where communion and Eucharist come back in. They're able to have a society that makes sense, at least in their town.
What a great lesson for your children, and what a unique opportunity to have them be able to share, or for you to share that experience with them, and have that memory and that sense of connection that they'll have to Sister Maura and the other women now for the rest of their lives, and hopefully we'll see the legacy of those women live out in your children. So that's beautiful. Again, we're joined today by Eileen Markey, the author of Radical Faith, the Assassination of Sister Maura, referring to Sister Maura Clark, who was murdered along with 3 other churchwomen on December 2nd, 1980. And this Friday is the 36th anniversary of that murder. Eileen, thank you so much for being with us today, for writing this wonderful book, this tremendously in-depth look at Sister Maura's life that I think takes us beyond just that kind of snapshot or that soundbite that we know of these 4 women. And it really provides us with an in-depth understanding. As I've come to learn more about the 6 Jesuits who were killed in 1989, one of the things I've really appreciated is coming to learn and understand what it was like as they came to El Salvador, what their hopes were as they arrived, and what was progressing as they went on. And they showed up a little bit later. They showed up in the late 60s, but into El Salvador from Spain. But some of the same things, kind of experiencing this transformation in the church and in our world related to Vatican II and to social movements and to things there. So Eileen, again, thank you so much for being with us today. Really grateful, and good luck continuing to share the story of a radical faith, and especially on this anniversary coming up on Friday. Prayers for you of thanksgiving for your commitment to sharing this story. So thank you for being with us today, Eileen.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you. Thank you so much.
All right.